The maid was sent to silence the desolate prince, not to heal him, not to comfort him, but to ensure that his voice, his presence, and his very existence would quietly fade behind palace walls. To the court, he was a problem best kept unseen, a royal shadow whose sorrow was mistaken for weakness, whose isolation was more convenient than truth. She arrived with no title, no protection, and no permission to care. Yet, in the long hours of guarded silence, she noticed what no one else dared to see. The prince was not broken. He was being erased. And as she listened, truly listened, she understood that his despair was not madness, but the result of a life stripped of choice. By understanding him, she became dangerous. Because once someone understands the truth, silence is no longer possible. In the year 1857, the north wing of Ashcombe Palace remained untouched by laughter. Its windows were kept shuttered, its corridors watched by guards who spoke only when necessary. Servants avoided the area, lowering their eyes as they passed, as though sorrow itself might be contagious. Within those walls lived a prince the kingdom preferred not to remember. He had once been the spare heir, then the problem, then, finally, the secret. They called him Desolate, not because he raged or wept, but because he had learned the danger of being heard. Silence, for him, had become a form of survival. The palace did not announce his confinement. It simply adjusted its routines. New locks, stricter schedules, caretakers who did not ask questions. And when those measures proved insufficient, they chose something far more effective than chains. They chose obedience. Margaret Hale was known for exactly that. She was quiet, precise, and forgettable, the kind of maid who left no trace behind her. With no family to question her absence and no future the palace needed to consider, she was the perfect solution. She was sent not to understand the prince, but to manage him. What no one anticipated was that understanding does not require permission. It requires patience. And once Margaret stepped into the north wing, listening where others had commanded, the palace's carefully maintained silence began to fracture. Margaret Hale crossed the threshold of the north wing just after dawn. The air there felt different, cooler, heavier, as though the walls themselves had learned to hold their breath. She carried no more than a small tray and the folded paper bearing her reassignment. No instructions beyond the unspoken ones. Observe, obey, do not interfere. The corridor stretched long and narrow, lit by tall windows veiled with dust-softened light. Her footsteps echoed more loudly than she expected, and she slowed her pace, instinctively aware that sound was unwelcome here. At the far end stood a single door. 2 guards flanked it, neither of them young. Their expressions were composed, but not indifferent. They watched her with the careful scrutiny reserved for something easily misplaced. "She's expected," one of them said quietly, after glancing at the paper in her hand. The door was unlocked without ceremony. Inside, the chamber was neither lavish nor bare. It was furnished as one might prepare a room for a guest who was never meant to leave. A desk stood near the window, a chair beside it, books arranged with excessive neatness, their spines unbroken. The man seated by the window did not turn when Margaret entered. Prince Alistair Roland stared outward, toward the pale gardens beyond the glass. His posture was rigid, as if movement required negotiation. Dark hair fell untrimmed at his collar, and his hands rested in his lap, still and deliberate. Margaret hesitated. She had been told what to expect. A volatile temperament, unpredictable moods, a mind weakened by solitude. Yet what she saw was not disorder, but restraint. "My lord," she said softly. No response. She took another step forward, careful not to intrude upon the space he had claimed. "I have been assigned to attend to your household needs." Still, he did not turn. For a moment, she considered that he might not have heard her at all. Then his fingers tightened slightly, just once before relaxing again. "You may leave it there," he said. His voice was calm, measured, worn smooth by disuse. Margaret set the tray down where he indicated. She did not rush away. Instead, she waited. Waiting was something she understood. Minutes passed. The prince remained, facing the window. "You need not stand," he said at last. "I will not require conversation." "I understand," Margaret replied. She remained standing anyway. As the silence stretched, she noticed details she might otherwise have missed. The faint tremor in his breath when footsteps passed the corridor outside. The way his gaze avoided his own reflection in the glass. The subtle tension in his shoulders, as though he were bracing for something that never arrived. "You are new," he said quietly. "Yes, my lord. They send new ones when the old ones learn too much." Margaret's hands folded together. "I do not intend to learn anything," she said. "Only to serve." He smiled then, not with warmth, but with weary recognition. "That," he said, "is what they all say." The guards outside shifted. The sound was unmistakable. Prince Alistair's attention sharpened at once. "You may go now," he said more firmly. Margaret hesitated. "My instructions were to remain available," she replied, choosing her words with care. Silence followed. Then, slowly he turned. Up close, she saw the cost of his confinement. Not madness, but exhaustion. His eyes were clear, observant, and profoundly tired. "You are very brave," he said, studying her, "or very foolish." Margaret met his gaze. "I was told you preferred quiet." A pause. "Yes," he said, "I do." "Then I will be quiet," she replied. Something shifted in the room. Not relief, not trust, but curiosity. He turned back toward the window. Margaret remained. She did not speak. She did not fidget. She did not attempt kindness where it was not invited. When at last she withdrew, it was without instruction. Outside, Lady Hawthorne waited. "Well?" she asked. Margaret lowered her eyes. "He requires very little," she said carefully. Silence. "Routine." Lady Hawthorne nodded. "Good. You will see him twice daily. You will record nothing. You will report only irregularities." "And if there are none?" Margaret asked. Lady Hawthorne's gaze hardened. "There are always irregularities," she said. "You simply haven't noticed them yet." That evening, alone in her narrow quarters, Margaret found she could not sleep. The prince's voice lingered in her thoughts. Not what he had said, but what he had not. For the first time, she wondered whether her task was truly to silence him, or to ensure that no one ever listened closely enough to hear the truth. Margaret's schedule was delivered the next morning without ceremony. A folded paper, 2 times listed in precise ink. Morning attendance, evening attendance. No instructions, no questions permitted. She learned quickly that the North Wing operated on a logic entirely its own. The guards changed shifts without greeting one another. The servants assigned to nearby corridors worked in silence, communicating only through glances and gestures. Even the clocks seemed to tick more softly there. Prince Alistair was always awake when she arrived, never pacing, never reading, always seated near the window, as though the light itself were the only companion he trusted. Margaret did not ask questions. She tidied what little there was to tidy, replaced cooled tea with warm, adjusted curtains according to the hour. Days passed. Silence became routine, and within that routine, patterns emerged. The prince never touched his breakfast until the guards outside completed their morning round. He flinched at raised voices, even distant ones. And when bells rang elsewhere in the palace, his jaw tightened, as though bracing for an unseen blow. No one else noticed these things, or if they did, they chose not to name them. One afternoon, as Margaret set fresh linens on the chair beside his desk, she noticed faint marks along his wrist. Not wounds, not bruises, impressions, as though something had once been clasped there for far too long. She said nothing. Silence, she had learned, was often safer than sympathy. "You observe too much," Prince Alistair remarked one evening, without looking at her. Margaret paused. "I observe what is required, my lord. That is rarely the same thing." She resumed her work. The guard shifted outside. The familiar sound made the prince's shoulders stiffen. "They tell you what I am," he continued. "What I am meant to be." "They tell me very little," Margaret replied. A quiet sound escaped him then. Not laughter, not quite bitterness. "Then they're learning," he said. The day stretched on. Margaret's presence became predictable, unremarkable, necessary. She learned when to enter without startling him, which questions to avoid entirely, how to speak without expectation, and slowly, imperceptibly, The air in the room began to change. One evening, as the sun slipped low and cast long shadows across the floor, the prince spoke again. "Do you know why they call me Desolate?" he asked. Margaret hesitated only a moment. "No, my lord. They prefer words that sound poetic," he said. "It makes cruelty feel refined." She remained still. "They once called me defiant," he continued. "That was before I learned the cost of resistance." His voice did not waver, but his hands clenched once, briefly. Margaret felt something shift within her. Not pity, recognition. "They do not punish loudly," he said. "They punish quietly, over time, until obedience feels like relief." Margaret swallowed. "I am sorry," she said softly. He turned then, not sharply, not suspiciously, simply enough to meet her gaze. "You should not be," he said. "You are here to maintain the quiet, and you do so very well." That night, Margaret returned to her quarters with a weight she could not set down. She began to notice changes elsewhere in the palace. Whispers that ceased when she approached. Eyes that lingered a moment too long. Lady Hawthorne summoned her 2 days later. "You are settling in," Lady Hawthorne observed, fingers steepled on her desk. "Yes, my lady. You report nothing." "There is nothing to report." Lady Hawthorne studied her. "That is unusual." Margaret lowered her gaze. "He follows his routine precisely," she said. "He causes no disruption." Lady Hawthorne smiled faintly. "Good. Then the system is working." Margaret felt a chill she could not explain. As she turned to leave, Lady Hawthorne added, almost casually, "You understand your purpose, of course." Margaret paused. "To attend his needs," she replied. Lady Hawthorne's voice cooled. "No, to ensure his compliance." That evening, Margaret arrived later than usual. The prince noticed at once. "You were delayed," he said. "Yes, my lord." "Were you questioned?" She considered lying. Instead, she chose carefully. "Yes." He nodded, as though expecting no other answer. "They are watching," he said quietly. "So am I," Margaret replied, before she could stop herself. He looked at her then, truly looked. For the first time, his expression softened. "Be careful," he said. "Understanding is not a harmless thing in this place." Margaret straightened the curtain by the window. "I understand that now," she said. And as she stood there, framed by fading light, Prince Alistair realized something unsettling. The silence that had once protected him was beginning to crack, and the one person who truly heard him was no longer invisible. The change was subtle at first. Margaret sensed it not through words, but through atmosphere. Doors closed more quietly when she passed. Guards lingered longer near the north wing. And Lady Hawthorne's gaze, once distant, had grown calculating. Prince Alistair noticed it as well. "They have adjusted the rhythm," he said one morning, as Margaret poured tea. "When the palace grows uneasy, it tightens its grip." She set the cup down carefully. "Why now?" she asked. He studied the steam rising from the porcelain. "Because stillness unsettles those who rely on control," he replied, "and because they fear what patience might uncover." That afternoon, Margaret was summoned again. This time, Lady Hawthorne was not alone. 2 men stood near the window, both dressed plainly, both unmistakably official. Their expressions were polite, their presence final. "You have spent considerable time with the prince," Lady Hawthorne said. "Yes, my lady, more than your predecessors." Margaret kept her hands folded. "He requires consistency," she said. One of the men smiled faintly. "Consistency is rarely necessary for someone so limited." The word struck with deliberate precision. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "He is not limited," she said before she could stop herself. The silence that followed was immediate. Lady Hawthorne's expression hardened. "Be careful, girl," she warned. "You are not here to form opinions." Margaret lowered her gaze. "I only meant—" "You meant too much," Lady Hawthorne interrupted. "Attachment clouds judgment. That is why your role exists." One of the men stepped forward. "There have been discussions," he said mildly, "regarding a more permanent solution." Margaret's breath caught. "Permanent," she repeated. "Relocation," Lady Hawthorne clarified, "where supervision can be absolute." Margaret understood at once. Not care, not safety, disappearance. She was dismissed moments later. The walk back to the north wing felt longer than usual. Each step echoed with urgency. Prince Alistair was standing when she entered. "They spoke to you," he said. "Yes." He nodded. "They always do, before the end." She set the tray down with unsteady hands. "What end?" she asked. He met her gaze calmly. "The one where I cease to be inconvenient." Margaret felt something within her fracture. "You cannot accept that," she said. "I have accepted it many times," he replied. "It changes nothing." She stepped closer. "It changes everything," she said quietly. The guards shifted outside. Prince Alistair lowered his voice. "They will move me soon," he said, "to a place without windows." Margaret's mind raced. "Why?" she demanded. "What are they afraid of?" He hesitated. Then, for the first time, he answered honestly. "My father intended to name me regent," he said, "when my brother fell ill." Margaret's breath stilled. "I refused," he continued. "I questioned the advisors, the treaties, the quiet cruelty masked as necessity." He smiled faintly. "That was my mistake." "They declared you unstable," Margaret whispered. "They declared me inconvenient," he corrected. The truth settled heavily between them. Margaret understood now. His silence was not weakness. It was survival. And the palace had no patience for survivors who remembered too much. That night, Margaret did not return to her quarters. Instead, she sought out Thomas Reed. He was a guard, older than most, quieter than the rest. A man who had once returned a book she'd dropped without comment. He listened without interruption. "They will erase him," she said. Thomas's jaw tightened. "I know," he replied. "They've done it before." "Will you help me?" she asked. He studied her. "Helping you means betraying the palace," he said. "Yes." He exhaled slowly. "Then speak quickly." The plan was simple, dangerous, and irreversible. The next morning, the palace awoke to unexpected movement. Servants whispered. Doors opened where they should not. And in the north wing, Margaret stood beside Prince Alistair as the guards entered. "It is time," one of them announced. Prince Alistair straightened. Margaret did not step back. She placed herself between him and the door. "No," she said. The word echoed. Lady Hawthorne appeared moments later. "Move aside," she ordered. Margaret did not. "You sent me to silence him," Margaret said, her voice steady. "But you cannot silence truth." Lady Hawthorne laughed softly. "You are nothing," she said. "A servant." Margaret met her gaze. "I am a witness." The pause that followed was fragile. Prince Alistair spoke then. "I will not go quietly," he said. "Not again." For the first time, the palace faltered. And Margaret knew, whatever came next, there would be no returning to silence. The moment stretched longer than anyone expected. Lady Hawthorne's expression did not change at first. It rarely did. She had learned long ago that hesitation was a luxury reserved for those without power. "Remove her," she said calmly. The guards hesitated, not because they questioned the order, but because Margaret Hale did not move. She stood before the prince without trembling, without pleading, as though she had already accepted the consequences of defiance. Prince Alistair watched her with quiet astonishment. "You should step aside," he said softly. "They will not hesitate." "I know," Margaret replied. Her voice was steady, not brave, resolved. Thomas Reed shifted his weight near the doorway. "Lady Hawthorne," he said carefully, "perhaps we should—" She silenced him with a glance. "This has gone far enough," she said. "The prince will be escorted immediately." Prince Alistair stepped forward. "No," he said. The word carried farther than Margaret's had. Not louder, but heavier. The guards froze. Lady Hawthorne turned toward him slowly. "You forget your place," she said. "I remember it very clearly," he replied. "I have lived in it for years." He straightened his shoulders. "You hid me away to preserve order," he continued. "You called obedience stability and cruelty necessity. But I am done cooperating in my own erasure." The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged. Margaret felt it ripple through the corridor like a hell breath. "You will regret this," Lady Hawthorne said quietly. "I already have," the prince replied. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the hall. More guards, more witnesses. Lady Hawthorne's gaze sharpened. "Take him," she ordered. Thomas moved first, not toward the prince, but toward the guards. Wait, he said. All eyes turned to him. You have no authority, Lady Hawthorne began. I have memory, Thomas interrupted. His voice did not shake. I remember the letters that came sealed and unsigned. I remember the orders that contradicted one another. And I remember the physician who vanished after declaring the prince of sound mind. A murmur spread. Lady Hawthorne's composure cracked, just slightly. You would betray the palace, she said. I would betray a lie, Thomas replied. Margaret felt something close to disbelief. The prince looked at Thomas, then at Margaret. You planned this, he said softly. No, Margaret replied. I hope. Lady Hawthorne stepped back. You are all replaceable, she said sharply. The palace endures. Prince Alistair moved then, not toward the door, but toward the light. He opened the curtains himself. Sunlight poured into the room, stark and unforgiving. I will not be hidden again, he said. Not behind walls. Not behind words. The guards did not move. For the first time, obedience faltered. Lady Hawthorne's voice dropped. You think exposure will save you, she said. It will ruin you. Then let it, the prince replied. I would rather be ruined than erased. Margaret felt tears rise, not from fear, but from release. The choice had been made. There was no quiet ending now. Within the hour, the north wing was no longer sealed. Doors opened. Servants whispered openly. Messengers were sent. The palace, so carefully balanced on silence, began to shift. Prince Alistair was escorted not to confinement, but to the central gallery. Margaret walked beside him, not as a servant, not as a protector, but as someone who had listened. Lady Hawthorne followed at a distance. Her authority was intact, for now, but it was thinning. In the gallery, members of the court gathered. Faces turned, voices hushed. Prince Alistair stood before them. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke. I was hidden because I questioned the ease with which power excuses cruelty, he said. I was silenced because silence was convenient. He paused. I will not beg for absolution, he continued, but I will no longer accept disappearance as duty. The room was still. Margaret watched the faces around them. Shock, doubt, calculation. Truth had entered the space. And truth, once spoken, is difficult to contain. Lady Hawthorne stepped forward. This is a misunderstanding, she said smoothly. The prince has endured much. He is confused. Prince Alistair turned to her. No, he said. I'm finally clear. His gaze moved then to Margaret. And in that moment, something unmistakable passed between them. Not romance. Not yet. Recognition. You, Lady Hawthorne said sharply, pointing at Margaret. You will be dismissed. Prince Alistair spoke before Margaret could. No, he said. The word landed with finality. She remains, he continued, because without her, none of this would have been possible. The court murmured. Margaret felt the weight of every eye upon her. For the first time, she did not lower her gaze. The silence that followed was no longer oppressive. It was uncertain. And uncertainty, Margaret realized, was the beginning of change. The days that followed were marked by waiting. Not the silent, suffocating waiting of the North Wing, but a different kind, tense, exposed, and irreversible. Prince Alistair was not returned to confinement. Neither was he restored to ceremony. Instead, he was placed in visibility. The palace did not know what to do with a man who refused to disappear, yet declined to perform. Margaret remained at his side, not officially, not publicly acknowledged, but unmistakably present. Lady Hawthorne did not confront her again. She did not need to. Her influence moved quietly now, seeking allies, drafting explanations, reshaping narratives. Silence, she understood, could still be useful if redirected. Prince Alistair understood this as well. They will not punish me openly, he said one evening, as they stood near the gallery windows. That would invite questions. Margaret nodded. They will try to wait, she said, until attention fades. Yes, he agreed, and until you are removed. Margaret felt the truth of it settle heavily. You can ask me to leave, she said. He turned to her then. I will not, he replied. Not again. The court convened 3 days later. Not a trial, not a declaration, a conversation disguised as formality. Prince Alistair was invited to speak. So was Lady Hawthorne. Margaret stood at the edge of the chamber, unseen by most, yet no longer invisible to herself. Lady Hawthorne spoke first. She framed the years of confinement as protection, the treatments as caution, the silence as mercy. Prince Alastair listened without interruption. When it was his turn, he did not refute her point by point. He spoke of memory, of being taught to doubt his own voice, of obedience mistaken for stability, of how easily isolation becomes policy when no one insists on witnessing it. "I was not hidden for my good," he said calmly. "I was hidden because I refused to agree." The room shifted. Then he did something unexpected. He gestured toward Margaret. "She was sent to silence me," he said, "and she failed." A murmur passed through the chamber. "She listened," he continued, "and because she did, I remembered who I was before silence became habit." Lady Hawthorne's composure tightened. "A servant's sentiment does not." "It does," Prince Alastair interrupted gently, "because institutions survive by convincing ordinary people that their witnessing does not matter." He turned back to the court. "I will not seek restoration," he said. "I will not demand inheritance." A pause. "I ask only for acknowledgement, and the right to exist without permission." Silence followed. Then one voice spoke. Then another. Not agreement. Not yet. But recognition. By evening, the decision was quietly made. Prince Alastair would not be confined again. His status would remain undefined. But his disappearance would no longer be enforced. Lady Hawthorne resigned 2 weeks later. Officially, for health. Unofficially, because silence no longer obeyed her. Margaret was summoned one final time. Not by authority, but by Prince Alastair himself. They met in the gardens at dusk. For the first time, there were no guards nearby. "No one has asked what you want," he said. Margaret considered the question. "I want to remain," she replied. "Not as your keeper. Not as your shield." He nodded. "As your equal," she continued. A faint smile touched his lips. "I was hoping you would say that." They did not speak of love. Not yet. They spoke of days shaped by choice, of voices used carefully but freely, of a future that did not require erasure to exist. When the bells rang that evening, Prince Alastair did not flinch. Margaret noticed and smiled. The palace would endure. It always did. But something essential had shifted. A man once labeled desolate now walked openly beneath the sky, and a maid once chosen for her invisibility had changed the course of a life simply by listening. Some silences are imposed, others are chosen, and the most dangerous thing of all is the moment silence ends. If you enjoy emotional period romances, subscribe to the channel and let these stories find you again.